Some very exciting new work has been done by my colleague Gretchen Hoffman from the University of California, Santa Barbara with sea urchins. She shows that sea urchins show a very declining calcium carbonate structure of the larval forms of the sea urchins. And she has formed some very exciting new genomic research to show that in the higher CO2 levels, there is an expression of the genes that control calcification, and it's a downward expression, not only for calcification, but for metabolism and other processes. And it's this genomics research that we will be able to understand mechanistically what the capabilities and the limitations for calcification in the future. So this is a very exciting new area of research that's going on. When you think of just calcifying organisms themselves, such as bivalves, clams, scallops, mussels, echinoderms, we're talking about within the United States a $2 billion a year industry. In fact, the shellfish industry within the United States is half the entire fishing industry within the United States. So this is an important issue. Not only does ocean acidification affect calcification, but it also affects things like fertilization rates for organisms, their ability, the egg and sperm to come together, increased juvenile mortality, particularly in fish and fish larvae. Here's an example where fish larvae were put in high CO2 waters, and there was anywhere from 60 to 100% mortality of fish larvae. So it is the very young larval forms that are more susceptible than the adults in most cases. And finally, there's reduced growth in the adults for many species, impaired oxygen transport for squid and other organisms. Squid depend on oxygen transport for them to capture their prey, so this is particularly important to them. And there's reduced metabolism for most organisms. Now, the other issue is what happens as we have impacts at the low end of the food chain. How does that affect the high end of the food chain? And I show you this simple pathway here from coccolithophorids, which are the marine plants, to the copepods, to the fish, or from the coccolithophorids to the pteropods to the fish. And you can see what happens at the food chain will have a significant impact on the fish. And here's one model output that shows that a 10% decrease in pteropod production leads to a 20% weight loss in mature salmon weight. So there is a direct connection through the food chain that we need to be concerned about. Now, there have been studies to show that these impacts can be seen naturally in the open ocean and areas where there are significantly higher CO2 levels naturally. And this is an important study that was done in Italy, where there was a natural CO2 seep from volcanic processes, and it was in a coral reef bed. In the region of the very high CO2 and low pH waters down to 6.8, we saw a loss of the coral reef species, and in fact a loss in most of the calcifying species, but an intensification and increase in the seagrasses. So you can tell from this that there will certainly be winners and losers, but how this permeates through the ecosystem, and particularly as important ecosystems like our coral reef ecosystems that provide fish resources for about 25% of all our fish resources. These are very serious issues that we need to concern ourselves. In this particular study that was done, it was shown that the calcifying organism went through a major change at a pH of about 7.8 or so. And this may well be one of the first examples of a tipping point. And I show these last two pictures here on the bottom, showing again we see where the organisms that are in these areas, their shells are dissolving while they're still alive. If you do a scorecard on what we know so far, it sort of looks like this. For all the calcifying organisms, we see almost all the organisms showing a declining response. There are one or two exceptions with the coccolithophorids that have different responses. This means we have to look at the species by species differences. For many of the other organisms, it's just a negative response. Photosynthesis, interestingly enough, there's a positive response with CO2, and this means we may be seeing a very significant shift in photosynthetic organisms from the way they are to what they might be in the future. This is particularly true for cyanobacteria and nitrogen fixers. So our entire ecosystem might change very dramatically, and this then would provide a feedback mechanism to the atmosphere that we should be concerned about in terms of the ocean's role in global climate change. And finally, reproduction is significantly affected as well, from what we can tell right now. So to be fair, we need to explain ourselves in clear of what we know and what we don't know. Most of the experiments thus far have been very abrupt with high CO2 and pH changes with specific species strains with short time duration experiments and large pH changes. So there's a lot we don't know yet, particularly responses of genetically diverse populations, synergistic effects with temperature, trace metals, and other species, particularly temperature and CO2, have shown deleterious effects for coral reef organisms, species replacements, community responses, and as I said, impacts the global carbon cycle. NOAA, USGS, National Science Foundation, and the NASA have all been working together to develop a national program on ocean acidification. And we have developed approaches to develop technology to observe it in the oceans, to model this with models, to do more physiological research studies, and have interagency program on ocean acidification. I do want everybody to know that there is now the capability of measuring ocean acidification on moorings. Here's the example of the very first mooring that has been deployed in the Pacific Ocean. And here we're measuring the PCO2 and the pH on a mooring, much as we would do with temperature, salinity, and oxygen. So we have the capability to monitor these processes in the oceans in real time. So I'll leave you with this thought. This is from my friend Carl Turley. This is the sunset of the oceans with man's footprint now detectable. It's warmer, it's more acidic, it's less diverse, and it's overexploited. The oceans, for certain, that we know that it will become more acidic. The way of reducing the impact of global ocean acidification is reduction in CO2 emissions, and we need a concerted national and international effort to reduce the uncertainties, vulnerabilities on our marine systems as soon as possible. Thank you.